Everybody, Sid here. Hey, listen, I am so thankful to be with you again this week, and we're talking about how do we wrestle with anxiety and fear? Do you know what I mean? What do we do with this stuff? And the reality is that, man, there are very few people that don't struggle in some way with anxiety and fear. It's part of living in a broken world that's not functioning the way that God designed it to function exactly. And as people, human beings, we're also broken. So we don't function exactly the way that God would have us function in this space. So things don't work the way necessarily they should. So we live with anxiety and fear when actually God's design is that we would experience peace and joy, correct? We know this, but we all struggle with it. And sometimes it's really hard to know where our fears even come from. Do you know what I mean? I've got this weird fear that I struggle with when it comes to snakes. I hate snakes, really, really hate them. When we first moved to Kelowna, Cole was hating moving away from home in Lethbridge, coming to Kelowna. So he was out with one of his friends and they caught a garter snake. He named it Herman, brought it home, and Jen saw that this snake, which I think is pure evil, actually brought my son joy. So she decided that Cole could keep the snake. And we didn't even talk about it. And I hate snakes. I remember coming home, finding this snake living in my house, and it freaked me out. Do you know why it freaks me out? Because I watched reels. I just saw a reel the other day where these people had what they thought was a snake in their ceiling. And all of a sudden the ceiling collapsed and it's multiple massive boa constrictors living in their house. And essentially that's what I had living in my house. That's what my son brought home. And I hate it because I just keep thinking this stupid snake's gonna eat me. Now, here's what we know. It's a dumb fear. It's irrational. There's no way that a little garter snake's gonna do that. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't consume space in my mind and remove some of my peace and some of my joy. We all get that. We all either have seasons where we struggle with fear and anxiety, or for some of us, our fear and anxiety has actually become part of our identity. It's it never goes away. So the question we've been asking is how does the gospel actually help us deal with our fear and anxiety? And last week, we talked about the reality that Jesus can actually help us live lives that have a type of peace and comfort, even in the midst of the difficulties and the chaos and the struggles. When we really set our hearts and minds on Jesus, he can transform and change us. Hey, here's what I want to talk about today. When fear and anxiety becomes overwhelming, when it starts to kind of come on us, are there things that we can do that can kind of just help us through the season, help us in the moment? I want to be really clear. For many of us, we might need a counselor or someone professional, maybe even a doctor, to help us through some of our very real issues that are creating anxiety and fear. That's not what I'm talking about here. This isn't the answer, if you will. What I want to talk about here today is just a couple of things that we could do that even in the midst of brokenness, we could still experience a type of flourishing, a type of peace, a type of freedom that God can give us as we just do a couple of real practical things that could maybe help us through some of these difficult moments or seasons, okay? Here's what I do. When I'm thinking about wrestling through seasons, when I'm full of anxiety or fear, or I'm talking to a friend who's maybe struggling with sadness or gone through a really difficult time, part of what we talk about, part of the journey we talk about is engaging in 3 activities. We call them read, write, and run. We just say, hey, what are we gonna do? Let's lean into read, write, and run. Now, they don't exactly define what we're looking for, but they help us refocus. So I wanna quickly share them with you as tools that you could use. They're in some ways, when we follow Jesus, we just have access to these resources that can actually help us move towards flourishing the way that God would have us to be. And I think these tools, by God's grace, help us move in that direction. So it's read, write, and run. Okay, let me explain what I mean. Number 1, read. I think one of the reasons why so often my fear and anxiety can own me is because I'm not thinking clearly. I don't see reality for what it actually is. Because if I can see what is truly real, and I can actually believe it, it can begin to transform my experience. So for instance, I walk into a reptile garden or a zoo, and I get freaked out because I see snakes there, and snakes freak me out. So it's traumatizing for me in the moment. But then if I just stop and I realize, wait a second, it's behind this closed in area. Wait a second, there's an expert person here who understands the situation and has created a safe space for me. Yeah, I know there's no way that that animal can get out of that space and come and get me. And even if it did get out, there's so many ways that I can escape. I actually have no danger in the space. And when I can begin to do good battle in my mind to remember what is actually true, it can help free me up and give me a type of peace, even in an environment that can be kind of scary for me. Do you know what I mean? As followers of Christ, this is what Jesus actually calls us to. In Romans chapter 12, verse 2, Paul, he says this, he says, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect." One of the first ways that we fight anxiety and fear is by seeing clearly what is actually true, and we see it through our minds. We've actually been given the truth that God has for us through his word, and we read it and it helps us put things in right perspective. When I read the scriptures that say that, if God is for us, who can be against us? Nobody. When I read the scriptures and the truth that says all things work together for good to those who love him. When I read the scriptures and the truth where it says he will never leave us, he will never forsake us, he can help give me a right perspective of what's real, and I can be transformed and changed by the renewing of my mind. So when I'm struggling with anxiety and fear, one of the first things I do is I really fight to see the truth of who God is, truth of what he's calling me to be and what he's calling me to do, truth of what he has for my future, and truth, compared to who he is, the situations I'm in, they don't compare, because the truth sets me free as I'm transformed by the renewing of my mind when it comes to God. Now, it's not just what I put in, but it's also the things I need to stop putting in that needs to happen as well. So for me, I'm thinking about, hey, sometimes when I'm sad or having a hard time, I tend to listen or watch things that aren't actually allowing me to be renewed by my mind. Hey, research tells us that kids who spend more than 3 hours a day on smartphones, they were 34% more likely to experience at least one suicide-related outcome than kids who use them 2 hours a day or less. Some of the things that we just know is that the more time we spend on our screens, the more negative effects it can have on our mental disposition or our emotions. And so when I'm thinking about reading, I'm not just thinking about what are the good things I need to put in. I'm also thinking about, hey, are there some other things I need to get out? Are there some messages that I'm listening to or hearing that aren't actually true, that don't actually line up with what Jesus says through his word? How do I remove those? And how do I just focus on the good stuff that actually helps me understand what is real? First thing I want to do is I want to read. I want to get to the truth of the scripture. I want to know God. I want to know what actually is the situation that I'm in, and I can be freed up by the renewing of my mind. Here's a couple of questions for you. Number one, is there a source of information that you need to limit in your life right now so that you can experience some freedom from anxiety or sadness or some of those struggles? Is there something you need to limit and set aside for a time? Number two, is there a source of truth, the scriptures, that you actually need to grow in your life right now? Are there some Bible passages that you need to focus on more so you can fight to know what's actually true and you can experience freedom? First thing we do, we need to read. Second thing we need to do is we need to write. When I'm talking about writing, what I'm meaning here is that we just be really honest with God. We begin to actually write down our prayers to him. We begin to acknowledge the things that we're struggling with, the things that are difficult, how we are actually feeling. You know what's really beautiful about Jesus is he never asks us to be emotionally disconnected from what's actually taking place around us. He asks us to be emotionally honest. In fact, in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 6 and 7, Peter, who's speaking to other people who are following Jesus, he says this, he says, "Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you." Basically what he's saying is, hey, acknowledge who God is. Remember, he's ultimately in control. He's ultimately for you. Give yourself over to him. That's why we read, get the truth so we can make that decision. And then he goes on and he says this, "Cast all your anxieties on him because he cares for you." And he's really serious about this. He's serious about acknowledging what are the things in our life that's causing anxiety for us, and would we fight to give those over to him because he actually cares. One of the ways we do that is just being really honest with God. So for me, that comes through journaling. I spend time and I write down, hey, what are the things that are creating anxiety or fear for me right now? What's helping me, hurting me in terms of how I'm relating to others, all these different things. And then what I do is I write them down and then I say, okay, God, I'm going to give this to you. I turn this over to you. And I just literally put a line through it as an act of saying, I give this over to you, God. And I wish I could say that if I just do it once, everything goes away. It doesn't work that way. There's actually like this real battle that takes place, and I have to keep coming back to it over and over and over again. But I'm trusting God to be true when he says that I can actually surrender these things to him. And in time, his spirit will be transforming and changing me as I acknowledge what's actually happening in my life and actually acknowledge God's hand in my life as I surrender these things over to him. So first, I want to read. Second, I want to write. I want to be really honest. Here's a question for you. Are you taking time to actually be honest with Jesus? And then second, what are some specific sources of anxiety that you might need to give to Jesus right now? And sometimes, you guys, it's hard for me to be able to even articulate what it is. And that's part of my prayer time to go, Jesus, I don't even know what's making me so anxious. Could you reveal it to me so I can surrender it to you? And he is so faithful. So first we go read. Second, we go write. And then here's the third one. This is my deal. I talk about running, read, write, and run. And here's what I'm shooting for. I think it's amazing how God has just designed us like so holistically. And when it comes to our physical bodies, like when we actually do healthy things with our bodies, there's these chemicals that properly begin to move throughout our minds that can help us renew our minds and be like transformed just by simply acting in a healthy way that God has designed for us. So one of the things that I do, or I say to my friends, is when I'm in a season where I'm really struggling, I just try to get up and move. And that's not easy, especially if you're like really sad, especially if you're struggling with like depression. One of the easy things to do is do nothing. And yet I really believe that God has designed us that when we get up, we begin to move, maybe get outside, maybe go for a walk, maybe just like spend some time properly breathing, that active movement allows the right chemicals to begin to function properly that can actually be a part of renewing our mind. And when we do these healthy things that God's designed us for, he uses these healthy ways of acting to start making us more healthy. And so I think this is so important. I remember with Peyton when he was really young. And Peyton used to struggle with anxiety and anger. They were real things. And I remember just going to him one day and saying, hey son, you know what? When dad struggles with like anxiety or anger, one of the things I do is I go for a walk. And that just helps me kind of get my mind right so I can begin to function in a better way. And I remember getting a call from my wife one time and she just goes, hey, Peyton and I have had this fight. And I think he just ran away. And I'm like, no way. Where do you run away to? And she goes, well, like across the street. I'm like, oh, he's probably going to come back. She goes like, it's really cold out there. I'm like, well, he'll probably come back sooner. And so we said, okay. And so she went back to her room. And then a while later, Peyton came home and he gives me a phone call. And I go, hey son, did you run away from home? And he goes, well, not really, Dad. I go, well, Mom kind of thinks you ran away from home. And he goes, well, remember, Dad, a long time ago, you told me that I should like go for a walk if ever I get really angry and it helps calm me. I go, yeah. He goes, well, that's what I did. I went for a walk. I'm like, son, that's awesome. I said, maybe next time you should tell your mom that. He goes, I tried, but she just locked me out of the bedroom. I'm like, all right, buddy, that's on you. But it helps and it transforms and changes us. And I think it's good for all of us to just lean into these healthy practices. So here's a question for you. What is one healthy physical activity you need to increase in order to experience emotional health or emotional flourishing? Hey, listen, you guys, life is not easy. I understand that. And we struggle. We struggle with anxiety. We struggle with fear. We struggle with anger. It's true. The gospel gives us resources that can allow us to be renewed, even though some of our situations may not change. But there's certain things that God has designed us to do that can help put us in a place that can allow for his spirit to do that renewing work in our life. 3 quick activities. Read, write, and run. Number 1, read. Get truth into our mind. Learn to fight to see what is actually real, what is actually true, and let the truth set you free. Number 2, write. Be honest with God. He doesn't ask us to pretend everything's okay when it's not okay. But when we come to him with our very real anxieties, he calls us to cast our cares on him because he cares for you. But we need to actively do the work of acknowledging these issues and turning them over to Jesus. And it might not just be once, it might be twice, but we just keep doing it over and over and over again because that's the way the Spirit works in our lives, releasing us and bringing us freedom. And then finally, we need to run, and maybe not literally run, but we need to move. Like God has given us physical bodies. And when we start treating them the way that God has designed us to treat them, it can help renew our mind and put us in a position where we can experience the peace of his presence. Read, write, and run. Hey, God bless you guys as you continue to fight to live flourishing in like a difficult season or experience that you might be going through.